According to author Philip Pullman, C.S. Lewis's classic Narnia series is blatantly racist. And honestly, the way the Calamine culture is depicted, it is questionable. It relies on Orientalism, Arab stereotypes, and the colonial idea that dark skinned people are bad and light skinned people are good. But was C.S. Lewis really a racist? And do the Narnia books perpetuate harmful stereotypes? Let's dive into it. Hey guys, Sarah Kwan here, ready to dive into some literary tea and answer the age-old question, was old Clive Staples a bloody racist? This is a hotly debated topic to this day, so it's going to take a bit of work to unravel it. So pull up a chair, grab some tea, please like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So in order to answer this question adequately, I am going to be using evidence, not just vibes, to get down to brass tacks. And that means I'll be looking at not only examples in the Narnia books, but C.S. Lewis's other writing and his behavior in his personal life. My answer may surprise you, so make sure you stick around to the end. So C.S. Lewis was an Irish man living in the UK in the early and mid 20th century, and that comes with certain ideas that we have grown past as a society. While the UK didn't have institutionalized segregation in exactly the same way as the US, they did have a similar equivalent. This was called the color bar, which would bar people of color from coming into or being patrons of certain establishments. And this wasn't outlawed until the Race Relations Act of 1965, after the death of C.S. Lewis. So yes, on the whole, racial stereotypes and harmful prejudices were very much alive in the time of Lewis, and there's a good chance that he internalized some of that. Now, getting down to the particulars of the evidence of this alleged racism in the Narnia books, let's dive into a few examples. The most heavily critiqued on this matter is the third book, The Horse and His Boy. Now, I really enjoyed this book. It was fast-paced. I loved the adventure. I love that we got to see some different parts of the mythical world. And in the story, we follow Shasta, who has taken a chance to run away from his adopted father, and he steals a horse. On his journey, he meets Avaris, who is also running away from home because her father was going to force her into a marriage. She has her own horse, so the two children and the two horses race through Narnia on this wonderful adventure to get to the promised land. Now, in this story, we are introduced to the country of Calormen, which is the southern empire south of Narnia, and it is described as people being dark-skinned, turban-wearing, and living in a desert. And judging by these various context clues, it seems that Lewis based them off the Ottoman Empire. They have a god called Tash, and they have this great storytelling and bathing culture. And in many ways, I think Lewis did attempt and did somewhat succeed in providing us with a complex and well thought out fictional culture. However, the conflicts of the book all revolve around the negative parts of the Calamine culture. Avaris is being forced into a marriage by her father. Shasta was going to be sold into slavery by his adopted father. These two eventually run into the Pevensie children, who are currently the kings and queens of Narnia, and Susan is being courted by one of the Calamine princes, Rabadash, and they find out that he's a scumbag. She wants to back out of the marriage, and he doesn't like that. He's basically planning to kidnap her and force her into a marriage. And furthermore, when Susan does escape Rabadash, he plans to not only hunt her down, but to take over Narnia and go and invade and use go against the code of honor to do so. And this is where the problem lies. The Calormene people are constantly depicted as deceptive, primal, almost barbaric. And this is where people take issue with the way C.S. Lewis wrote this culture. Many of the characters are cruel, backwards, and most of all, they worship the wrong god. And I do pay these sentiments. I do. But I do want to push back slightly and say that I don't think it's fair to respond by making a blanket statement like C.S. Lewis was a racist. I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think he was indeed a product of his time and possibly more xenophobic than racist. And secondly, as I've already mentioned, he does portray the Calormene culture as humans. He even allows them to intermarry with the Narnians. And thirdly, he wasn't just critical of the Calormene culture. In the very next book, Lewis goes ahead and critiques a white-skinned colonial culture. So, to my first point, yes, he was a white Christian man in the early 20th century, and racism was very much alive and well. He was also, as we know, not a fan of traveling. I think he only went to mainland Europe one time. So he wasn't exactly getting out there and learning about other cultures and diving in and trying new foods and things like that. And with the point of his Narnia series being to express his great love of Christianity and different aspects of faith, I think that he sort of had to shoehorn in another culture and another religion to juxtapose the two and to show that Christianity is the one and only way in his mind, which isn't great either. If I'm being honest, I don't think his depiction of the Calormene culture is racially sensitive, nor does it pass the pub test of 2026. However, I don't think that automatically means that Lewis himself was an outright racist. He was likely a little more xenophobic than anything, the type who would treat a Black Englishman with respect, but who might think that Arab people use too many spices in their food and that their language is weird. And that being said, in all his other writings, journals, letters, as far as I know, he never wrote anything explicitly racist. He didn't say horrible, outright things to the level of, say, Roald Dahl. Instead, he just made the mistake of writing a culture in a bit of an insensitive way that was a product of its time. But he also seemed to make an effort to write them as humans. And to my second point, he did write this complex and beautiful culture as best he could in a children's book. They have beautiful dresses, food, music, and dancing. They have this famous bath culture and fantastic storytelling. There are various well thought out characters like Avarice, who I quite liked. She's sassy, she's strong, she questions the negative aspects of her upbringing, and she doesn't just roll over and take this forced marriage, she stands against it. So I think if he was truly racist, all of his Calormene characters would have been idiots who fall to their doom. He also allowed intermarriage between Calormenes and Narnians. So, spoiler alert, but Shasta and Avarice get married, and their child, Ram the Great, becomes one of the greatest and most famous kings in all of Archenland. And if he were truly racist, would he have written that in? Now, I realize you could push back here and say that he allowed this to happen because Avarice effectively converts to Narniaism, or, worshipping Aslan, and that by marrying Shasta, her children would be whitewashed and Christian baptized and all that stuff. So it doesn't really matter. And I do accept that point. But as I said, once again, I believe Lewis was xenophobic rather than racist, and that we cannot expect perfection from him. And to my third point, Lewis shows his colors again by turning around in the next book, Prince Caspian, and critiquing the colonial aspects of a white culture in his stories. So in this story, King Miraz has usurped the Narnian throne from the rightful king, Prince Caspian. He plans to do away with him, take over, and he's also trying to rewrite history and stamp out anything about Aslan or the Pevensie children and things like that. He's a tyrant, and he is descended from the Telmarines, who invaded Narnia some century before and took it over. So Lewis is illustrating a white colonial tyrannical structure and critiquing that as well. And he was indeed explicitly anti-colonial in his other writings and in his personal life. And that sort of balances the scales a little bit for me. And lastly, while we're balancing the scales, I do want to push back on my own arguments a bit, to just throw it out there that while The Horse and His Boy seems to get the most heat for the racism allegations, I actually thought The Last Battle had more racist overtones. And the part that stood out to me the most was when Tyrion, Eustace, and Jill have to put themselves in brown face to sneak past the Calamine guards. To me, that whole device of using brown face to sneak through, it just felt really shoehorned and really unnecessary. And also, there were a few lines, such as when they washed the makeup off. Let me just read it to you. So they kneeled at the water, scrubbing the backs of their necks, puffing and blowing as they splashed the lather off, blah, blah, blah. They rearmed themselves in true Narnian style with a straight sword and three-cornered shields. Body of me, said Tyrion. That is better. I feel a true man again. Okay, you could say, you know, I personally don't like having mud caked all over me, and maybe he just meant it feels good to have that stuff off me, but it was just questionable to me. And also in this book, the black dwarves are the bad ones that refuse to answer to Tyrion, and once again, the Calamines are evil in this book, and I had so many issues with The Last Battle that I have to try not to get my wires crossed here. But once again, in a way of potentially balancing the scales, he does in the end, one of the warriors, Emeth, is accepted into heaven by Aslan. I'm trying to keep this from being an hour-long video because you really, really could pick it apart with a fine-tooth comb if you wanted to. I think you can see the point I'm trying to make here. Yes, Lewis's depiction of the Calamines is not racially sensitive, and it's absolutely not how you would write a dark-skinned culture in 2026. He was a somewhat ignorant, sheltered white man in the early and mid 20th century, and I think he sort of had blinders on when he wrote the Narnia series because he planned it to be this great series about faith, and that caused him to make many, many mistakes in writing it. But I believe he also tried to balance the scales by creating a complex culture with real human characters, allowing them to change and grow and even marry Narnians as long as they accepted Aslan. So that's where I'm at with this. Was C.S. Lewis a racist? By 2026 standards, I think a lot of people would say yes. But by mid-century standards, I think no. There simply isn't enough evidence to prove that he was genuinely racist, and that he wrote these questionable things with racist intent. If we had more, say, personal letters or journals where he was using slurs or other evidence from his personal life and other writings, perhaps we could come to a different conclusion. But I don't think that he was truly racist or that he was intentionally racist by the standard of that day. Rather, he was somewhat ignorant and maybe a little xenophobic. And that doesn't sit well with us in 2026, so I can definitely understand if you disagree with me. And you know who does disagree with me? Philip Pullman. This man has got C.S. Lewis living rent-free in his head. He wrote his entire His Dark Materials trilogy as a sort of rebuttal and critique of the Narnia books. He just hates the Narnia books, and he says that C.S. Lewis was not only a racist, but sexist as well. And I have to make an entirely other video to talk about the sexism allegations. And let me tell you right now, there is a little more evidence on that front. So tell me, where do you stand with this? Do you believe that we can read these old texts and accept the moments of cultural insensitivity and accept that they are imperfect? Or do you think that we need to have a book burning? I'm gonna be continuing on this Narnia business for a while, so stick around, subscribe, like, comment on this video, please, pretty please. And check out my last few videos. I did a Pride Month series last month. That was a lot of fun. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.